Movie Central, the place to talk about movies, TV shows based on movies, toys based on movies, games based on movies, and rides based on movies. I'm your host, Mr. CCS, and these are my pets. George the Gorilla, Kahal the Dolphin, and Frank the Sea Turtle. Guys, in times like these, you must wonder why there are so many reboots to things that were already great on their own. Don't get me wrong, some of these reboots actually stand out, while others deserve to rot in the depths of you-know-what. Today, I'm not only going to be talking about a reboot that is rotting down in that fiery realm of Hades, but also comes from that same area. Not gonna lie, this isn't gonna be easy.
So, out of all the comic book movies out there, among the most underrated ones are Guillermo del Toro's Hellboy films. They're well shot, well written, and overall should be watched by anyone who's a fan of the genre. Unfortunately, I say they are underrated partially because of their shockingly low box office. Seriously, you look at these movies and realize that while critics enjoy them, they both didn't do extremely well. The only reason the first was allowed to have a sequel was because the first film was a big hit on film video, and the two animated films were also well received at the same time. Now, unfortunately, the home video sales for the Golden Army were kinda non-existent, because this was around the time when digital media became a bigger deal. Nowadays, it's rare to see someone buying physical media anywhere, all because of streaming services. Moving on. The third Hellboy film was considered by Guillermo del Toro, but by the end of the day, the low numbers of the second film killed all hope for the third film ever happening, especially considering that it was supposed to be grandiose in scale and needed a big budget. With del Toro out, Ron Perlman also left the project, refusing to play the character unless del Toro was involved. Losing Guillermo del Toro was a really bad call considering the fact that he went on to make The Shape of Water, which won Best Picture. Oh, regrets. With Del Toro's series put to rest, Hollywood decided to do the next logical thing and reboot the series, with David Harbour, better known at the time for playing Jim Hopper on the critically acclaimed Netflix series Stranger Things, set to star as the title character, and the film was to be directed by Neil Marshall. Knowing his style and presence as a horror director, he seemed like a good choice to make a scary R-rated monster movie, which even included some ideas from the proposed third Guillermo del Toro movie. Unfortunately, studio interference occurred, because that's a thing that movie studios like to do nowadays, and the movie dropped into theaters in April of 2019. How did it fare? Oh boy, you're in for a treat. The movie not only flopped critically, but also financially. It couldn't even make its budget back. With this movie having failed, they're making another reboot which releases in late 2024, aka this year, which nobody really seems to have any interest in. However, how well does this movie fare after all this time? Spoilers not well at all, but what do I think about it?
Well, it's time to get it out of the way. This is the 2019 reboots of Hellboy. Freaking kill me.
While battling a trio of rampaging giants, the legendary half-demon Hellboy, played by David Harbour, encounters Nimue, the Blood Queen, played by Mila Jovovich, an ancient resurrected sorceress who's out to avenge a past betrayal. Suddenly caught in a clash between the supernatural and the human, Hellboy soon becomes hell-bent, no kidding, I just said that, on stopping Nimue without triggering the end of the world.
Okay. Here comes the inevitable question, and please mind my use of foul language when asked. What the fuck happened to this movie? From all of the onset drama to interviews with the director, it's extremely clear that the final product was not at all what was envisioned from the beginning. From Neil Marshall's interview with fellow YouTuber The Critical Drinker, he wanted to make a gritty horror movie with strict use of practical effects. Yet you watch the final product and it's horribly edited, extremely convoluted, and full of shitty VFX that I cannot comprehend was considered okay for the big screen. I am just so baffled at how awful this thing turned out, and I really feel sorry for Marshall. He wanted to make a big blockbuster movie and saw that as his big break. Unfortunately, he considers it something he never did and always talks about it in a negative light. I have never seen something like that before, and now that I have, I can confidently say that studios need to back the fuck off when a director has a clear vision for something. I know that I've covered stuff like this before, but now that I know how much it can take a toll on the filmmakers, I have full permission to make the statement I just said. I don't blame Marshall for this at all. I blame the studio for constantly fucking up his project and rushing it out into theaters when it was clearly unfinished. So with that rant aside, you can clearly tell that I hated this movie. Is it on my list of no pointers? No, and there are very few reasons why, but I'll explain more in depth. Let's just get this over with.
Okay, let's talk about the only decent part of this movie. David Harbour as Hellboy. Now, here's why I don't enjoy him as much as Ron Perlman. Ron was to Hellboy what Kevin Conroy was to Batman. He understood and embodied so much of what the character stood for that no one is ever going to be able to top him. They can be good or even great in the role, but they will not be Ron. That said, there are moments in this new movie, not scenes, moments, where I could see parts of Hellboy from the comics. Some of his jokes made me laugh, and his mannerisms of being this very jaded creature with a soft heart were pretty decent. If given a good script, I have no doubt in my mind that David would have done an amazing job in this role, considering his roles as Hopper on Stranger Things, especially in the second and fourth seasons, as well as some other roles where he plays this kind of character. Thankfully, David is getting redemption in the comic book adaptation realm with his roles as Red Guardian in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, and even a future role with Eric Frankenstein in Creature Commandos. Overall, David was a decent Hellboy, but he could have been so much better. Moving on to the other characters, we have this movie's version of Professor Broom, who is played by Ian McShane. This was not Professor Broom. Professor Broom is a kind-hearted, caring father figure to Hellboy whose fascination with monsters leads him to having many enemies that Hellboy also makes. The professor in this film is a condescending, demeaning, pretentious douchebag that even considered killing Hellboy when they first met. May I remind you that Broom in the comics and Del Toro's films was the one who took Hellboy in and gave him his name almost instantly, and also treated him like he was his own son. I'd call this character assassination, but I don't want to, because I'm just going to say that this isn't Professor Broom to me. For the remainder of this section of the video, I'll be calling him TB. I was willing to live with this being TB's character if the movie was the beginning of a character arc for him, learning to be a more present and good father figure, but it's not at all what happened. He dies here, and even in the afterlife, when he's supposed to be giving Hellboy words of encouragement, he's still demeaning and hurtful. Yet he says he loves Hellboy anyways? Where's the connection to this? At all! Whatever, I applaud Ian McShane for doing a decent job of what he was given, but this was a poorly written character that I cared nothing about when he died. Whereas I definitely cared about the death of the professor in the 2004 movie because he was a genuinely good character and a great father. Moving on to the two characters of assistants to Hellboy in this film, instead of having the two most popular characters that work alongside him, Liz and Abe, we have two characters in the comics who, while I admit are interesting, are nowhere near as iconic as Abe and Liz. Starting with Daimyo, the idea of a Werecat Special Forces up is a great one, and I wonder what he would have looked like in Del Toro's films. In this film, Daniel Day Kim portrays a douchey character, because everyone in this movie is a complete jerk-off, which didn't work because he's essentially just a human Hellboy. Also, his scar is nowhere near as gnarly as it is in the comics, and this movie has an R rating. Take that as you will, but this is way too much of a PG-13 scar. Remember this, Cronin in the original looked even gnarlier in the 2004 movie, and that was a PG-13 film. You are being outplayed by a 20-year-old PG-13 film, which kids are allowed to see, and that is why you fail. Congratulations, Lionsgates! Moving on to Alice, maybe I would have liked her character more if we saw her bond with Hellboy more, because I know that these two have a big history in the comics, being one of the people he had a relationship with, as well as someone whom he's known since she was young. Here, there are elements of that, but all I see is something that is extremely undercooked and far from finished. Maybe we would have seen more of the film, and from their relationship if the studio wasn't so eager to get to the end credits, but I'll talk about that later. Now let's talk about some of these villains. There are way too many villains for a cohesive story, and people complain about these 3 movies on screen and say that they're overstuffed, but this is a whole new level. Not only do we get Rasputin and Cronin in cameos, but also Baba Yaga, who's a big villain in the comics that does nothing and has a side plot that goes nowhere in this movie, and Lord Glarin, who has a comic-accurate design, and that's about it. The 2 villains the plot focuses on are the Pig Guy and Nimue. In the comics, these 2 are a pretty big deal, but here they are freaking nothing. The Pig Guy has a long rivalry with Hellboy in the comics that is condensed into, 30 minutes of actual content on screen. Meanwhile, Nimue is just a goofy main villain that is nowhere near intimidating. If you think anything good about this character could have worked or existed, I'll tell you how it doesn't in these 5 words. CGI head falling into lava. To be fair, I've heard that actress Mila Jovovich isn't a terrible one, and I will have that proven to me by watching all of the Resident Evil movies next season. #Shameless plug. So prepare to feel my wrath. Overall, I don't want to talk about these characters anymore because they're either undercooked, badly written, or just forgettable. Let's move on. How are the effects? Well, if you recall my rant from a few minutes ago, then you know the answer. Christ, these look awful! From the monsters looking barely polished to the CGI blood splatter to obvious CGI recreations of characters, this has got to be some of the worst CGI work I've ever seen in any movie, and that's probably down to the studio trying to rush this out so much. I also need to talk about the horrible editing in this film. There are so many jump cuts and so much bad continuity to the point my brain starts to hurt. And I've edited films myself, so I know how strenuous that process is and how hard it is to get done, but geez, this is worse than Suicide Squad. In fact, this is the 2nd worst editing in a movie I've seen in my career thus far, being only topped by Superman 4: The Quest for Peace. Moving on to the music, I'd say I'd pay more attention to Benjamin Wallfish's score if the movie didn't constantly shove licensed musics down our throats like there's no tomorrow. Geez, I've never been put out or off by licensed music in movies before, but I was wickedly enraged at how bad this movie uses it. It is constantly, and I mean constantly, pushed into your face, and I was just irritated and wanted to hear an effective orchestral score, which the movie actually has at some points. I don't get why they did this, but I have no doubt that it was in regards to the studio interference. As far as action scenes go, the only, good one was at the very end, which I feel was a tease of what we could have gotten, because the horrible editing and effects of this movie really hurt a lot of the action scenes, which is super unfortunate and the reason why I'm not going to be talking about them. Overall, this movie is not just a failure as an adaptation, it's a failure of a production, filled with horrible effects, obnoxious editing, and a horrendous use of licensed music and a rough production. This is an easy contender for the list of the worst comic book movies of all time. David Harbour is decent, but even he couldn't save this garbage. Overall, while it doesn't get a 0 out of 10, it barely gets any points at all. Not even a full one. It gets an aggressively low half a point out of 10. I hope I never have to see this direct again, and I hope to God that studios get their act together. Though I seriously, unfortunately, doubt it.
My God, I hope that something like this doesn't happen on the channel in the near future. Until then, I've got 2 movies to review next week, which is hopefully going to be better than this hunk of junk I just talked about. Until then, and with that said, my name is Mr. CTS, these are my pets, this is Movie Central, and that, my friends, is Rob. See you next week. And make sure that this stays buried where it belongs.